Unaware that the next few minutes would completely upend her existence, she entered with a smile on her face and, in a matter of seconds, Catherine's composed facade broke down, tears running down her cheeks as the physicians revealed a reality that no mother should have to hear. Why hasn't this test been made public yet? What took the palace by surprise? What does this signify for the monarchy and Prince Louis? Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve deeper into what this actually implies for the royal family. It started out as a routine summons, the same type Catherine had responded to many times. There is no warning, no haste, a gentle request, and a courteous tone. However, the timing seemed off, as if the air had changed before she had even stepped through the door. Before they spoke, people in the palace halls had a habit of whispering, and the silence was overwhelming this time. The atmosphere indoors was clinical, the music was controlled, and the subject matter was far too serious for what she had been assured were everyday issues. Yes, Prince Louis had undergone evaluations, but she was told that nothing that required alarm had happened, as these were routine monitoring and cautious developmental check-ins. The faces on the other side of her, however, conveyed a different message. Tight facial expressions, deliberate pauses, and carefully chosen sentences. Then the language arrived, for which no parent is ready. Phrases that carried weight, terms that sounded final. Physicians didn't guess. They remained firm. They talked as though the decision had been made long ago, as though this moment had just been postponed rather than found. And she was broken by the delay, the knowledge that something so grave had been taking place in the background, behind guarantees and procedures, in silence. Catherine lost all of her composure, not softly. The sound of a chair scraping back, a loud gasp for air, and shaking hands as reality hit in were later described by insiders. There was no confusion here. This was a collision between guilt and shock. The type that poses insurmountable queries. How could I have missed this? Before me, who knew? Why now? The palace machineries came to life in a matter of minutes. The phones fell silent. Internal channels were shut down. People stopped talking in the middle of sentences. Orders were given forth without justification. Aides moved quickly in order to contain rather than to console. Include information. Control your response. Hold Catherine herself while she was led out of sight. According to witnesses, she vanished down a secret hallway with a pale face, red eyes, and the burden of something irrevocable resting on her shoulders. Whatever had just been revealed was not supposed to leave those walls. Therefore, staff members were told not to talk, not to make assumptions, not to recall what they had seen. However, secrets tend to seep through gaps that nobody initially notices, and the palace was already preparing for impact, while Catherine was left alone with the type of fear that rewrites a mother's universe. This moment could not remain buried in the past. However, in order to fully comprehend the gravity of this moment, we need to return to the symptoms that went unnoticed and the indications that the palace attempted to overlook. He was the playful light of the palace. However, beneath Prince Louis's mischievous smile were subliminal cues that many people overlooked, some disregarded, and others wrote off as a passing fad. In retrospect, those symptoms appear horrifying. Who buried the hints, and what were they? It began with minor details that were initially hardly perceptible. Silent pauses during play that used to appear like imagination but now cause concern, a delay in word formation, and instances when his coordination slipped. Prince Louis was expected to grin on cue, and the royal itinerary was jam-packed with engagements, appearances, and orchestrated picture sessions. However, there were times of bewilderment, hesitancy, and uncertainty. The team started to observe Prince Louis's tendency to become tired easily at events, waving for a few minutes, then clutching Catherine's hand, clearly exhausted. Online videos showed him dozing off throughout ceremonies, blinking slowly and appearing aloof. It was deemed cute by fans. According to commentators, he was just overloaded. However, some insiders started muttering, it didn't feel quite right. The nanny was the first to gently and cautiously say it out loud to a senior assistant. She had witnessed the growth of other kids. Prince Louis was unique. She observed that he had trouble following directions, stumbled, and frequently froze when overstimulated. She was expressing concern, not terror. However, the royal machine's interest can be harmful. Catherine heard it. Long before she was informed, she sensed it. Mothers always do. She sensed something was off because of the deep, unsaid bond she shared with Prince Louis. However, she was greeted with tight smiles and clipped assurances each time she raised it, and each time her voice faltered in concern. Boys developed differently, they stated. They added, he's under a spotlight. He just needs time. But Catherine was afraid it wasn't time. They were wasting time ignoring it. Previously joyful family films recently resurfaced as melancholy prophecies. Prince Louis didn't answer his name in the birthday clip. The picture of him in the yard, staring off into space for too long with a blank look. Catherine started going over them again and again, searching for trends, pleading for a misunderstanding. However, the reality just became more apparent. Experts had already been surreptitiously and silently approached. Catherine desired assurance. Answers, not protocol, not tabloid speculation. The tests were ordered, however they were halted in the middle of the request and execution. The pause button had been purposefully hit by someone in the castle. The logic seemed obvious: timing, privacy, optics, and image. But the price is inexcusable. Prince Louis was falling between the cracks of an organization that cared too much about its reputation to safeguard its own. And that silence was starting to be broken by Catherine, the woman who had always kept to the rules, who had learnt to live gracefully under the strict control of royal duty. And court politics stepped in just as Catherine started to demand answers, starting a conflict that would pit royal tradition against a mother's intuition. She pleaded for an explanation. A protocol was given to her. Advisors loyal to the monarch, not to Catherine, blocked her silent appeals behind the gilded walls of the palace. What were they keeping hidden? How far did they go to keep the truth from coming out? In the days that followed the first diagnosis, Catherine was fighting an institution rather than a sickness. She wasn't requesting any headlines at all. She was requesting second opinions and more discussions with top experts than the ones the palace had personally chosen. However, the response was consistently no, not yet, not required, not advised, and below every well-crafted denial sent the same message. Hold on, keep silent, hold your ground. Advisors urged prudence. The results were referred to as preliminary. They stressed that nothing was confirmed, that any mistake may lead to a media frenzy, and that moving outside palace channels could raise unwarranted concerns. Catherine, however, perceived it as a much more sinister form of containment. They were not investigating the truth. It was in control. Every time she tried to find greater clarity, she encountered bureaucratic coldness, delays, or misdirection. It was more than apathy. The resistance was calculated. The relationship between Catherine and her private secretary, who was long considered to be one of her closest allies, rapidly deteriorated. According to sources, she addressed him late one night in a hushed voice that was trembling with anger. "Why do you defend the organization, but not my son?" She didn't receive a satisfactory response, because none existed. Ever the symbol of poise, Prince William was in a tight spot. He was a future king as well as a father. Despite his intense love for his wife, the man was brought up to serve a greater good. Catherine pulled herself up against him. However, insiders say he was frequently conflicted and cautious. "Please be patient," he said. He prayed for trust in the procedure. However, the procedure was choking her. Despite being well-informed and precisely instructed, King Charles apparently responded in a disdainful and even clinical manner. He talked about responsibility, story, and legacy. He never once spoke the word Prince Louis to her, according to Catherine, who claimed that omissions spoke louder than words. Then Queen Camilla moved in the darkness. She kept quiet in public. There was no need for her to. Behind the scenes, her influence was felt subtly but decisively. Many people think that Queen Camilla's staff were the ones who intimated in private that the future queen was getting hard to control, discouraged additional testing, and presented Catherine's worries as emotional outbursts. Whispers became murmurs, and judgments were influenced by murmurs. It wasn't merely a case of Catherine being overlooked. They were silencing her. The weight of custom and control weakened her voice, her intuition, and her parental authority. Additionally, each door she knocked on closed a bit quicker. She was no longer fighting for answers. She was fighting for the very right to inquire. However, secrets about Prince Louis can only be kept hidden for so long. Furthermore, the leak didn't drip when it did occur. The truth exploded. It was not intended to escape, however. Everything changed with a single encrypted message. The royal media was rocked by an anonymous, terrifying, and unquestionably real leak from deep within the palace medical wing. Why now, and who leaked it? The message came out of nowhere. One encrypted email addressed to a seasoned reporter who breaks stories others wouldn't. Initially, it was unrealistic, too personal, too delicate, and too risky to be true. However, that file contained information that could only have been known by a small group of persons inside the royal gates. The journalist didn't hesitate, since the medical language, dates, remarks, and specifications were so exact, and the information was so unsettlingly accurate. It was too explosive a story to ignore. A firestorm broke out in a matter of hours. The email contained what seemed like a royal internal memo, devastating, clinical, cold, and undeniable. It described a diagnosis that had never been made public and cited internal disputes regarding the results' disclosure. Most damningly, it revealed that the results had been known for weeks. The consequences were disastrous. It was a betrayal as well as a medical emergency. A system based on secrecy was collapsing from within, not simply a child in danger. A full-scale fear broke out among the palace's media staff. There was no communication. They summoned emergency meetings. Controlling damage wasn't only required, it was already too late. Now that the leak had escaped containment, it was on its own. It was quickly picked up by news outlets. Speculations screamed from the headlines. Without confirmation, experts offered their opinions on the condition. Additionally, the hashtag number Pray for Prince Louis went viral all over the world. The public, caught off guard and devastated, wanted explanations, but the palace was unable to provide them. Not just yet. Catherine learned via her phone, not from her husband or her assistants. A notification with a title she hadn't approved, for which she hadn't planned or even been alerted. According to insiders, she was incensed at the quiet that had compelled someone to act in secret rather than the journalist or even the leak. At the organization that had decided that the only way to expose the truth was via desperation. Then the murmurs started. Who was responsible? Was Catherine being sabotaged from within, or was it someone close to her? Some said it was a rebellious act. Others muttered about deliberate sabotage, a planned action to cause mayhem. Behind shut doors, names were floated, employees were questioned, and loyalty was questioned. However, the leak had shown more than just a problem. It had revealed a falsehood. The palace had spent decades creating its gleaming exterior, yet it had been ripped apart by it. Additionally, it had put Catherine in the middle of a tempest that was beyond the control of any spin doctor. The test result itself, however, stood out above the rest despite the confusion and the terrible truth it exposed. This was more than a diagnostic. The revelation would rock the populace, change the royal line, and leave Catherine permanently haunted. The air fled the room as soon as the doctor finished speaking. What does this signify for Prince Louis and the monarchy's future? Catherine's fears were validated by the leaked report, but its contents went much farther. Rare neurological, progressive, and a genetic oddity, the ailment had eluded early identification until it suddenly manifested symptoms that were impossible to ignore. With sterile detachment, doctors described it. However, the implication of what they said was far from icy. Only management and no assurance of normalcy were available. There was no cure, only years of worry. The prognosis was dismal, yet cautious. The difficulties Prince Louis would encounter would change over time: cognitive development, physical skills, and speech. Every accomplishment would be a struggle. Days of improvement could occur, but there would also be reversals. The future would be uncertain, not for him, not for the family, and most definitely not for the monarchy that once hoped that he would one day stand next to his brother on the Buckingham Palace balcony, waving to a sea of loyal subjects. The fallout was instantaneous within the palace. Advisors hurried, not out of compassion, but for their own safety. Care was no longer a topic of conversation. They had to deal with consequences, what would happen to the monarchy's reputation, succession, and the appearance of stability it so desperately sought to preserve if Prince Louis was no longer a potential heir. Plans and messages needed to be revised, and somewhere in the midst of all of that was a mother who was broken, Catherine. In the end, the truth behind the palace walls is rarely as simple as the statements released to the public. Behind the crowns, the ceremonies, and the carefully polished traditions, there are still human lives, parents making impossible decisions, and a child caught in the middle of a system that has existed for centuries. For Prince Louis, the future now looks very different from the one once imagined for him. The balcony appearances, the royal ceremonies, and the expectations of monarchy may fade into the background, replaced instead by a far more personal journey, one focused on care, protection, and the quiet fight for normalcy away from the world's gaze. But the questions surrounding this story are far from over. Was the palace truly protecting a young prince, or protecting the image of the institution itself? And how many truths still remain hidden behind those historic walls? One thing is certain. The moment Prince Louis disappeared from public life, something inside the monarchy shifted forever. Whether this chapter becomes a story of compassion, secrecy, or transformation will depend on what happens next. Now we want to hear from you. Do you believe the royal family made the right decision for Prince Louis? Or do you think there is still more to this story that the public hasn't been told? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into royal secrets, hidden palace stories, and the moments the headlines don't fully explain, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. This is Royal Unveiled, and we'll see you in the next story.